All right, guys, welcome back to the Falcons Central Radio on Pro Football Central Radio Network. I am one of your hosts, Aaron Freeman, joined by my co-host Matt Karoly. Today, we're going to be talking quite a bit about Grady Jarrett's new contract. We're going to be talking quite a bit about upcoming contracts for other potential Falcons that we could see done in the coming weeks and months, as well as sort of talk about some of the key positional battles heading into training camp, where we're in our expectations for who might win some of those battles and how certain things might play out, who's on the bubble, those types of things. So we got a jam-packed show, and of course, as usual, we will be answering your Falcons mailbag questions. It's been a while since we've done a show. I know the last time we did a show, I promised that we would be back every week, and apparently, as usual, plans go awry or whatnot. But we are back fully, just in the nick of time, right before Falcons training camp, and also coming at you guys less than 24 hours since Grady Jarrett signed his new deal. And Matt, I know you weren't as sort of concerned about the deadline coming up with Grady Jarrett getting signed, and believing that a deal would get done eventually, whether it was before the deadline or after the season. But I am sort of curious, did you have any bit of anxiety leading up to 4 o'clock on the Monday before Grady Jarrett signed that deal?
I mean, the only anxiety really I had was, the longer it pushed towards the deadline, or if it went past the deadline, as we speculate, as me and you went back and forth on Twitter on Monday, I thought the number was just going to increase. I thought that Grady's camp was probably looking at that time for 18 to 19 million a year. And I thought the Falcons, wanted to kind of keep it around the 15 to 16 million range. So, once we saw the agreement in place at 3 o'clock and saw the numbers that, it was 4 years, 68 million, which equates to 17 million a year. I thought that was great for both parties. I thought, again, that's what negotiations are all about, when two sides come together, meet in the middle. And, that's kind of what they did here. And for the Falcons, I mean, the reason that they're a winner in this deal is just the fact that, you're retaining one of your better players, arguably your best defensive player for the next 4 years, and a guy that, is on the upward trend into the top, 5 best defensive tackles, you could say, in the league. Pro Football Focus, I believe, had him as their 5th rated defensive tackle this past season. And, when you're signing guys to these big level contracts, it's not what they've done for you in the past. It's what they're going to do for you in the future. And as Grady even said it himself, he's just kind of scratching the surface of the type of player he is. And I'm a big believer in that as well. I think we are going to eventually see those Pro Bowl and maybe even all pro caliber type seasons from him. So from the Falcons standpoint, it was a huge win, getting the deal done before the deadline. You don't have to worry about it then next season, whether they have to tag him again or go through this all over again. So from that standpoint, that's why the Falcons came out as winners. And then, for Grady Jarrett getting that big payday and, that 17 million a year average, puts him there, right below Fletcher Cox in 3rd place on the defensive tackle scale. And, he eclipses guys like Kawan Short and the Geno Atkins and the Jarrell Caseys of the world, which I think that makes sense for him. I think, he's not quite there yet. I think he's knocking on the door and knocking on their heels, in that stratosphere. I think, Fletcher Cox and Aaron Donald are in a league of their own. And we even talked on Monday on Twitter, if you look at Fletcher Cox's deal and you kind of adjust it into 2019 cap dollars, he really should be making 20 to 21 million. Now that's an Eagles problem and a Howie Roseman problem and a conversation for another podcast. But, those guys are fairly kind of head and shoulders above the rest of the group and deserve to be in that $20 million range. Whereas Grady, I think it makes sense for him to be in that 17, 18 million range, which is kind of where, the chips fell. And, if you break the deal down a little bit more, it's essentially a 3-year, $51.5 million deal, I believe, which, his actual, the average on that puts him slightly ahead of Fletcher Cox's $17.1 million average. But again, that's kind of how these contracts work. If you're the next man up, you are going to eventually pass maybe someone that you're maybe a little bit inferior as far as a player, but it's not, again, it's not something that hasn't happened before for other players at other positions. That's kind of the way the NFL marketplace works. Is if you're next in line, you're likely going to surpass some guys that maybe are a little bit better than you. But again, from both sides, both parties win in the situation. Falcons get to keep one of their best players for the next 4 years at least. Grady Jarrett gets a fair market value deal, and also by it being a 4-year contract as opposed to a 5 or 6 year deal, he has a chance to get another bite of the apple, so to speak, in his year 29 or 30 season, depending on if they decide to restructure in that final year. But so in that regard, he comes out even an extra winner, because he's going to get a chance to more than likely get a third contract in the NFL. So again, kudos to Thomas Mitchell and his staff for getting it done. It did look bleak early on from the reports. I know you and others on Twitter kind of went on a little bit of a roller coaster of emotions there, but at the end of the day, it got done, and we got Grady Jarrett in Atlanta for the foreseeable future.
Yeah, I think you pointed out the main points that I wanted to touch upon, with the essentially being a 3-year deal, and basically come 2021, the Falcons will either probably, if Grady Jarrett has sort of performed at a high level over these next 3 years, which I think he will, you're going to probably get another contract extension that, by that time, what the cap is going to be, you're probably talking about another contract, probably in the $15 to $20 million a year range, if not even potentially more than that, at that point in time. And I think you nailed it right when you talked about, like, Fletcher Cox signed his contract in 20 and made $17 million a year in 2016 dollars, and sort of the way that you got to think about it, because the cap goes up every year, it's like, you got to kind of adjust for inflation, like they always do with movies and whatnot. And if you adjust for inflation, you're right. Like, Fletcher Cox's deal is like worth $21 million. You saw a lot of pass rushers this offseason. DeMarcus Lawrence signing for $21 million. You saw Frank Clark signing for $20 million. You saw Trey Flowers signing for $18 million. And like, for me, and we talked about this on Monday morning and Monday afternoon, going back and forth on Twitter. Like, I think both of us seem to be in the mindset that this contract could be pretty massive, and the fact that the Falcons only paid, 17 million a year, when, it could have been 18, 19, 20, or whatever the case may be. And I think, Grady and his agent would have been justified for asking for that type of money, because I really do think that his side had the Falcons a little bit over the barrel in terms of sort of leverage and whatnot, because, differing from you and a lot of other people, I was not confident at all that if this deal didn't get done on Monday, that it would get done after the season, just because there's a very, basically sordid history of players playing on the franchise tag that get second contracts from that team. Most of these guys, you go back the last 5-10 years, most of these franchise players, if a deal doesn't get done that first year before that deadline, a deal, generally speaking, never gets done. Without that team basically doing what the Cowboys did this past year with DeMarcus Lawrence, by basically making him the third highest paid player in the NFL, or the third highest paid defensive player in the NFL. And that wasn't necessarily something I thought the Falcons would likely do if they weren't willing to do that, before the deadline. So I think this was a great move for both parties. Again, as you said, Grady's probably got another 5-6 at least more prime seasons. I feel like, a lot of people were talking about, oh, he hasn't proven himself to be, on the level of Fletcher Cox, on the level of Aaron Donald, which is fair. But, like, I think when you compare him to like a Geno Atkins and what Geno Atkins was his first couple of years in the NFL, I think in a lot of ways Grady Jarrett does come out a little slightly ahead of Geno Atkins in some phases. I know Geno Atkins had a big year in his third year and made the All-Pro, but it is one of those things where I feel like, all the people that are, I think, questioning this move and being like, why did the Falcons pay him? I think a lot of these people are going to look pretty stupid a year or two down the road when Grady Jarrett is sort of earning all the accolades that, various people were sort of knocking him or the Falcons for, paying him despite not earning these Pro Bowls and All Pros and all these various things. And so I think, again, and whether, you care about the Pro Bowls and whatnot, I don't, but it's one of those things, like, everybody that watches football for a living knows how good Grady Jarrett is. Everybody who watches football for a living talks about how Grady Jarrett's one of the best D tackles in the league and one of the most underrated D tackles in the league. And so I think, for the Falcons to get him locked up and essentially have him anchor their defensive line and arguably potentially anchor their defense for many years to come, I think is a great move. So I'm definitely happy. I was very confident leading up until Monday morning that the Falcons would get a deal done. And then, when Adam Schefter and other people were like saying, oh, the deal's unlikely, I'm like, what is happening? And so that's the emotional roller coaster that Matt was referring to, because it was like, I've been living a lie for like the last 6 months thinking this deal was inevitably going to happen. And then you guys pull the rug out from under me and say that it's unlikely to go down. So I'm glad it got done. And it's eager now to sort of, the Falcons to turn the page potentially and see who's the next guy in line to get these contracts. You're looking at Julio Jones as a player that the Falcons have been talking about for over a year, trying to get a deal done. So it seems like he's probably the next man up. But you also have Deion Jones and Austin Hooper, both of whom are free agents after the season, that I think we both agree that the Falcons are going to probably prioritize getting, deals done with, if not during this season or before this season, that immediately after the season, as the two guys that they probably most want to re-sign that are impending free agents heading into 2020. So I'm curious, Matt, who's the next guy? I'm assuming that you're thinking Julio Jones is probably the most likely candidate to be the next big payday for the Falcons.
I do, and just to kind of close the book on the Grady Jarrett thing, part of the reason, my emotions were at ease with him, and this kind of relates to Julio Jones as well, is everything that Thomas Mitchell, everything Arthur Blank said, I kind of took their word to heart. And I know that it's a business and you can't always do that, but I think you made the point, and it was probably partially facetious too, a little bit, but Arthur Blank has never told a lie to us. And,
that was not sarcastic, Aaron. That was me being 100,
well,
because that was one of the reasons why I was so confident heading into the deadline, because I was like, we've never heard them say the things that they say and not get a deal done in, the 17 years that Arthur Blank has been the owner and the 12 years that Thomas Dimitroff has been the GM. So I was confident, and that's why it took me, off kilter Monday morning.
Well, the reason I put that disclaimer on it too is I haven't kept a list of all of the, what they say and what they don't say types of things. And we haven't had, I don't think, too many instances. I mean, Matt Ryan obviously is one where they say they're going to take care of Matt. We haven't had too many players in this tenure that I can remember that they've said these things about. So again, Julio Jones is in that realm, and what they've said about Grady Jarrett just, again, put all my tensions to rest. And I was like, they're going to get it done, whether they get it done at this deadline or not. Again, I wasn't concerned, because I do realize at the same time, I think there was a little bit of a difference of opinion, as I said, with the 15 to 16 million number, and then Grady's camp's trying to get 18 to 19, and that's why I brought up the Pro Bowls and the accolades. That, again, those are fair things that I think teams do use at the negotiating table as a way to try to bring the number down a little bit. But as I also said, you are paying these guys for what they're going to do in the future, not necessarily what they've just done in the past. So again, that's kind of why I wasn't concerned with Grady. And going to Julio now, that's why I'm really not concerned with Julio. And I think he is rightfully going to be the next in line, just because Arthur's, it's been his word that that's what they're going to do, and they're going to take care of him. And again, I think part of the reason too, this is what I thought in the back of my mind as far as why Julio has shown up to, the mandatory off-season stuff this year as opposed to last year. I think there has been kind of an unwritten agreement, a handshake that, we're going to get this done kind of during the preseason, kind of like how they got his first extension done, which came at the end of August in 2015. So that's kind of the timeline at the very latest that I'm expecting this Julio Jones deal to get done. Obviously, I think it's next in line. They can turn their attention. I know they're bringing Drew Rosenhaus, Deion Jones representation in on Wednesday, so they will be working kind of simultaneously with that. But I think when it comes to Deion Jones' situation, my prediction right now is I think Drew kind of wants to have some baseline conversations with Falcons management, but at the same time, I do also think he wants to kind of wait and see what this, off-ball linebacker market really shapes up to be. Is it exactly what CJ Mosley got, or is CJ Mosley a market outlier? I mean, because even Quan Alexander, the contract that the 49ers gave him, that's pushing towards 13, 14 million a year. That's more than the Luke Kuechlys and Bobby Wagner's of the world are receiving. And I'm not sure exactly when Kuechly and Wagner's I know Wagner's actually in the midst of negotiations, I think, with Seattle. So I think he wants to see all that stuff play out. So I'm not sure he's going to be anxious to get a deal done right away. But, obviously the best case scenario would be for both Deion Jones and Julio Jones to get their deals by week 1. But, right now my prediction is they're just kind of starting the process. And I don't think Rosenhaus is going to be in a hurry. But, again, if he does get something done in the next couple of weeks, I'm not going to complain at all. I think, Spot Track I was looking on last night kind of has Deion Jones in the 13 million a year market value average. So, that would be a great deal. I totally sign on the dotted line right now for something like that, as opposed to, waiting it out and it being 14, 15, 16 million a year, or dare I say that 17 million a year that CJ Mosley's getting. But yeah, for me, I think Julio's next in line. All the talks are 20 million a year. I had thrown out a suggestion a month or so ago as to what I thought. I thought maybe a 3-year, $60 million extension on top of his current deal. The total money on that would put him slightly below Odell Beckham, in terms of total and average. But I think at age 30, making 17 plus million a year, whereas Odell's at 18, I think that's fair for him. And, I think he'd be cool with that. So that's kind of what I'm thinking. But, surely I think in this next month, they're going to be back at work and getting a lot, done with at least Julio. We'll see about Deion Jones.
Yeah, I think with the Julio thing, and I'm with you. My expectation is Julio's deal will get done by the start of the season. Whether it gets done before the start of training camp next Monday will have to remain to be seen. I'm not that optimistic about it, but obviously it could happen because that's traditionally the Falcons do try to get these deals done before camp starts so that they don't have to do. But I think historically, I don't think they've gotten a Julio. I don't think in 2015 his extension happened until the middle of August, like a couple weeks into training.
Yeah, I think it was the end of August.
Okay, yeah. So, yeah, because I think AJ Green was like a week later, and that was like right before the season started, I think. Mm-hmm. So yeah, you're right. So I think the key with Julio really is whether it's a 20 million a year extension or whatever the case may be. I think the real thing with Julio Jones, the thing to keep the eye on is sort of how much guaranteed money he gets over the next 3 years. You see with Antonio Brown's contract he just signed with the Raiders, he's getting about $50 million over the next 3 years with the $4 million in incentive. I think that's really where this is at. Like the Falcons can add on any amount of essentially dummy years to the end of that, whether it's a 4th year, a 5th year, or whatever, in order to make the contract look better or bigger in a per year basis. But ultimately, I think really what this contract is going to boil down to, guaranteeing Julio's contract over the next 3 years, whether that's 50, 51, 54, 56, 60 million, is sort of where the negotiation lies. And I think that's probably a little bit easier a negotiation than the Grady Jarrett deal. So it should come together pretty quickly. And then that sort of puts them, you lock in Julio for the next 3 years. You have Calvin Ridley. Calvin Ridley's his contract's going to be up in 2022 after the 2022 season. But traditionally with the first round picks, the Falcons like to do those deals after their 4th year. So basically after that 2021 season, the Falcons are going to probably be talking to Calvin Ridley about getting him an extension while he's in sort of smack dab in the middle of his prime. And then at that point, depending on how these next 3 seasons go with Julio Jones, whether he slows down, whether he's still, playing at the Julio Jones level that we've come to know over the last, 6-7 years, will sort of then allow them to then readjust his contract and do whatever they need to do in order to, basically, satisfy Julio for whatever might be the last couple of years in a Falcon uniform or whatnot, and readjust those things and try to balance those things between him and Calvin Ridley, with, paying both of those guys if they decide to do that, commensurate with sort of their roles in the offense at that point. So I think that's really the key with Julio Jones. So again, whether it's a 4-year, $80 million extension or a 5-year, $100 million extension, I think at the end of the day, it's really about how much guaranteed money he gets over the next 3 years. And, the piggyback off what you said with Deion Jones, my expectation, if I'm putting myself in Drew Rosenhaus' shoes, I'm definitely, the spot track estimation. I'm just like, okay, that's ridiculous. I want to reset the market because I know my client is better than CJ Mosley, or at least is more valuable than CJ Mosley in this day and age in the NFL. And I want to reset the market. And you mentioned Bobby Wagner. He is a free agent after the season. So is Miles Jack. Luke Kuechly is going to probably be coming up on a contract extension pretty soon because the last year his contract is 2021, and the Panthers have basically been renegotiating these last couple of years, or restructuring, I'm sorry, these last couple of years. And so probably if he has another good season, you're going to see him try to push the market forward. So I think if I'm Drew Rosenhaus, I'm like, $18 million a year or something like that for Deion Jones. You look at the potential franchise tag for Deion Jones. If the Falcons can't get a deal done between now and the end of the season, you're talking about roughly about 16.5 to 17 million for linebackers. You then tack on another potential franchise tag in 2021. That would be almost $20 million, roughly $36 million over the next 2 years. If basically Drew Rosenhaus just sat on his thumbs and did nothing, the Falcons would be forced to franchise tag Deion Jones twice in a row, and he would earn 36 million, and that's over 2 years, that's 18 million a year. So I think that's really a starting point. And like if you did the same thing with Grady Jarrett and his franchise tag, and if he had been tagged again next year, it would have been about an average of about 16.75 million. So he wound up being about 17. So I think that's a good way to sort of generate sort of maybe some leverage for the player, at least in terms of a starting point and what types of contract he's going to get. So, you look at the Mosley contract, it's really like a 3-year, $51 million deal. And so I think if you're Deion Jones, you're looking at trying to get, a similar amount of money, 50, or more $1 million over the next 3 years. And if you can get that guaranteed, because Mosley's got 43 million guaranteed on his contract, if you can get like 51, 52 million guaranteed, that would be a big move, and certainly in sort of resetting the market for off-ball linebackers in Deion Jones's case. So I think that's going to be something to keep an eye on. But I agree with you. I don't think Drew Rosenhaus is going to necessarily, be in a rush to get a deal done, because I think he's going to want to reset the market. And so if the Falcons are coming in at 13, 14 million a year, it's going to be like, oh, I'll just hang up the phone and wait, because I know eventually I'll be able to get what I want. And I think this is a similar dynamic between the Falcons and Grady Jarrett, where I think in the cases of Deion Jones, in the case of Grady Jarrett, the players have a lot more leverage in this negotiation than maybe the team does.
Yeah, and I think you look at how you talked about the franchise tag and how it would be 16.5 million. They're not going to let Deion Jones walk. They're certainly going to slap that on him. So you're right. I mean, kind of like how Grady Jarrett was, the franchise tag was 15 million, and you saw what the ending number was as far as 17 million a year, and then the following year would have been 18 million. So $33 million in 2 years. Grady Jarrett kind of would have been guaranteed had they just let this thing play out. So Deion Jones, is sitting in a very powerful position as far as what this contract could be, and the effects of that CJ Mosley contract certainly doesn't help. And it's funny because I think me and you had a discussion on Twitter last year when the Eric Kendricks and Benardrick McKinney contracts came out, and both those guys got 5 years, 50 million, both second round picks the year prior to Deion Jones. Both kind of got 20 to 25 million guaranteed, and that seems like forever ago, even though it was only last year. And now we're looking at 13 to 17 million dollar a year contracts for off-ball linebackers. And certainly when Bobby Wagner gets his deal, that's only going to strengthen that number. So this is probably going to be a pretty high number. We'll see if we're saying the same things that we're saying about the Grady Jarrett deal, as far as us thinking maybe 16 to 17 million is what they're going to be looking at, and they somehow get them to 15 million a year. That could probably be considered a win at the end of the day. But I think this is going to be a longer process than probably that report yesterday indicating that Drew's going to be in Atlanta meeting with Arthur and Thomas and all those guys on Wednesday. I think this is going to take until next year, but we'll see what happens. But yeah, this is the one I think I wouldn't say fans should worry about, but it's certainly it could be the difference between keeping a guy like Austin Hooper or not. I mean, depending on how large this contract is, because then you're looking at a scenario where you got Matt Ryan, $30 million a year. And we've talked about them trying to restructure to lower that number, but you're going to continue to push that can down the alleyway. So regardless, you're going to have to pay the piper as far as the 30 million or so year contract there. You got Julio Jones possibly going to be in the $20 million cap range. Grady Jarrett, 17, 18 million a year. Jake Matthews, 14, 15 million a year. So basically what I'm trying to get at, as far as what I see the future, as far as contracts go in 2020. So right now I have a projected 28 players under contract in 2020. Now that includes a couple assumptions as far as cuts go. I have Mohamed Sanu being a cap casualty. I have Ty Sambrailo only making it 1 year with Caleb McGarry, going to be firmly the right tackle of the future. I have James Carpenter gone. I have Matt Schaub gone. James Carpenter is a post-Q1 cut. And then two others that, again, it's up for discussion. I have either Devontae Freeman or Desmond Trufant, one of those guys potentially being a post-Q1 cut. Whichever one it is, it's going to be $3 million of dead cap. And then, again, I have Ricardo Allen right now. Now, that one's, again, dependent on his long-term health, but it's certainly, a possibility, I guess you could say. So with those assumptions, 28 players under contract, doesn't include Deion Jones, doesn't include Austin Hooper, doesn't include Devondre Campbell or any of the 2016 draft class members. 152 million, 0.84. And if we're going to assume a $200 million cap, that would mean 47 million for 25 players, which doesn't look great. That's less than a $2 million average. So, Falcons are going to continue to have to draft well to make all this work. So that's why, depending on how high this Deion Jones number is, I mean, the contract that I was kind of throwing out there on Twitter yesterday with Deion Jones being in that $13 million a year average, he would be looking at a cap hit roughly of about 10 million in 2020. So again, you would take away 10 million from that 47 number. You'd have 37 left for 24 players. So again, even worse. So depending if that number gets higher, that might be the difference between, an Austin Hooper re-signing or, an Austin Hooper having to get a contract elsewhere, much like Tevin Coleman, much like, Dontari Poe, Taylor Gabriel, Adrian Claiborne before his return. So, as has been the case the last several years, the Falcons are going to have to make some tough decisions. And that's why this Deion Jones one is definitely one to monitor to see how high it really goes.
Well, as many can guess, Matt said a lot there. I don't agree with a lot of that. The first thing I'll point out is I think because 2020 is the last year of the CBA, there are no post-June 1 cuts because 2021 is uncapped. True. So, like, some of these players that we can sit there and like, oh, he could be a post-June 1 cut. I don't think you can do that next offseason. So that's one thing. So, you'll have to go back into the drawing board and sort of maybe readjust some things there. I don't think Austin Hooper's really in danger of not being re-signed. I think he's going to be the priority number 2 after Deion Jones next offseason. I think really the trickle-down effect is going to be for more of the Devondre Campbell type of players. And whether or not the Falcons, push certain veterans that you mentioned, like Sanu, like Sambrailo, et cetera, out the door a little sooner rather than later. But I think the thing that the Falcons have in their back pocket is that sort of Matt Ryan contract adjustment where I think, we got into a discussion with DW over at the Falcoholic yesterday. I can't remember the number off the top of my head, but I think it's like 10 to 14 million that the Falcons can cut off of their cap next year by just redoing Matt Ryan's contract. And I think the reason why it's not that big a deal with him is because come 2022, you're going to redo Matt Ryan's contract anyway. So it was one of those things where, like, you don't mind punting money down the line for Matt Ryan because you're going to he's not going anywhere. So like the fact that, oh no, you're moving money to Matt Ryan's age 37, age 38 season is not that big a deal, because assuming Matt Ryan is like some of these other quarterbacks and can play at a reasonably high level until he's 38, 39, 40, like you're not necessarily worried about that. So I do think restructuring his contract next year and probably the offseason 2021 as well is going to be a quick and dirty way that the Falcons can potentially create cap space so that they can get deals done with some of these guys like an Austin Hooper and possibly a Devondre Campbell if the level of play improves in 2019, I think. But I don't think Austin Hooper is really in danger of losing his job, just because I think there isn't any reason at this point to really think that the Falcons have another option other than re-signing Austin Hooper at this point, particularly if you do move on from Sanu. Given that Julio Jones is up there in age, I think retaining two key pieces to your passing game, with a young Calvin Ridley and an emerging Austin Hooper, are going to be priorities for the Falcons moving forward. So I don't think Austin Hooper is really going to have to worry about it. The Falcons will find some way to get that deal done. And again, if that means restructuring Matt Ryan's contract, restructuring Jake Matthews' contract, restructuring Desmond Trufant's contract, whoever it is, in order to create some cap space and create some relief so that they can fit all these guys under the cap, I think we're going to see the Falcons do that. Because I think really when you look at all these contracts, whether it's Deion Jones or Austin Hooper or Julio, Grady, Matt Ryan, Keanu Neal, it's really about like a 3-year window right now where the Falcons are sort of going to have all these guys under contract playing at a high level for the next 3 or so years, hoping that they can sort of win a Super Bowl in that time. If they don't, then they'll have to sort of make new plans. And, that's giving Matt Ryan an extension and adjusting things and maybe giving Ridley an extension, and Isaiah Oliver's coming up and all these various other things. So that'll be a bridge that they can cross when they get to it. But I think right now the Falcons are in a good position that with the Grady Jarretts and the Deion Jones and the Takk McKinleys and the Keanu Neals, in addition to, Austin Hooper and some of these young offensive linemen, that they're in a good position cap-wise. It's going to be a little tight, obviously. They're going to have to make some adjustments, but I don't think getting the top-end players on their roster re-signed is going to be an issue for them. It's really going to be that middle class of the roster that's going to have some struggles. And you might, like you mentioned, Ricardo Allen. I think Ricardo Allen's probably going to be back next year, but he is one of those players that the Falcons could, if he doesn't necessarily come back strong this season, that could be a potential move that the Falcons could decide to part ways with next offseason and it will create additional space. But again, I think that's more likely to be a 2021 thing. But, obviously all this stuff is sort of fluid in terms of how players perform this year. Like, Robert Alford, while it was a chance that he would get cut going into last season, no one expected him to fall off of a cliff to the degree that he did. That made it basically, by the time we got to like week 13, it was like, oh, it's a foregone conclusion that Robert Alford's not going to be back next year. So, it's things like that are yet to be decided. And so all of these things are fluid and, all of this stuff is just, speculating on different scenarios and whatnot. So we'll have to sort of see how some of this stuff plays out this season on the field.
Yeah, and just, going back to the capped, uncapped year, just to educate the viewers and stuff. I mean, if they get a CBA done, though, that changes all. Which
I'm not optimistic about that. All the reports that are saying,
well, yeah,
they're working on it. I'm like,
the reports have been very optimistic, but I agree. Usually those things take a lot of time, and there's holdouts and stuff. But yeah, I mean, you don't sound too concerned about the future. I mean, the Falcons probably though are not players in free agency for the foreseeable future. No, because of the fact that they have to get now their core, their 2016 draft class guys, some of the 2015 guys. And then there's always the Vic Beasley conundrum and what could potentially happen with that as far as, this is a make or break year for him. Do you, I've seen you talk with others about it. I've kind of stayed out of the Vic Beasley realm because I feel like we're beating a dead horse here.
Wise choice, my friend.
Yeah, but do you think? Because I've seen some people say, regardless if he has a bad year or a good year, he's not coming back because of either he prices himself out of the Falcons range, or obviously if he doesn't have a good year, they're not going to bring him back since this is a make or break for him. what are your thoughts, I guess, ultimately on Vic Beasley as of
I mean,
today?
I've been since the offseason started. I've been like, I don't think there's much of any chance that he's back. I think the only realistic way that he's back is basically if he, and again, knock on wood, if he suffers a major injury and basically any market that he would potentially have just goes away and he's stuck signing a 1-year prove it deal. And thus then he could possibly be had for like 5 or 6 million or something like that by the Falcons. I think any other scenario, almost 90% chance or whatever, he's gone. If he has a good season, he's going to wind up pricing himself out of Atlanta. If he has a okay season, I don't think the Falcons are going to, want to pay him what his market value will wind up being, which because he's a pass rusher and whether or not you think he's a good pass rusher or not, just the fact that he plays that position similar to the quarterback position, there is a premium on those guys. So he's going to get probably a lot more money than I think most people and potentially by the end of the season, the Falcons as well think that he necessarily deserves, just based off of his regular level of play. So I think Vic Beasley's pretty much a goner. I think the Falcons are essentially their best case scenario is really just to hope that he has a very productive year and he winds up landing a big lucrative contract next offseason from some other team, and then they can collect a third round or a fourth round comp pick the following year for him, and that's really the best case scenario. Or maybe
you think it's about the comp pick? That's kind of why here they kind of doubled down and said, all right, we're not going to remove the 5th-year option so that they can get something in return for losing him?
I don't think that's the motivation. I think the motivation is genuinely the Falcons think there's still untapped potential from Vic Beasley that they can get on the field this year. I think that they legitimately believe that they can get something. I don't believe that.
Well, no, and I don't really either. But if that's the case, then why are you so confident that it's just one more year for him here? If they think there's something in there with him, it seems like a weird strategy then.
I think they believe that they like right now. If I hook Thomas Dimitrov and Dan Quinn up to lie detectors, they are probably confident that Vic Beasley's going to be back beyond the season. Like, oh yeah, we'll definitely re-sign Vic Beasley. I just personally think how the season plays out, regardless of how, if he has a great season, talking about a ridiculous amount of money. Like we're talking, 16, 17, $18 million a year. And I just don't think because of, some of these players that we're going to I think ultimately the Falcons are going to realize is like, we can't pay that type of money. Or if he just has another mediocre season, by the end of the season, the Falcons will be on the page that I think most of us are on, which is Vic Beasley's not worth a lot of money. And they'll realize in December what the rest of us have kind of known for the last couple of months, where he's not really worth the money. And then they'll be like, oh, well, and then on the, then the sort of the plus side for them, their little insurance or whatever you want to call it, it's just like, oh, we can get a decent comp pick for him down the road. But I think they think that, there's something there. There's some untapped potential. They can get some production out of him and he could be a long-term option for them. But I just think they're wrong, and they're just in denial about it at this point in time. So that's how I feel about it.
Yeah, I wish they were. No, I mean the fact that this is why I like the stat of this tie, because it's so frustrating. I mean, if you think this guy is going to be something for you, I don't know. Let's. I'm speechless as far as.
No, I think it just boils like.
This is why I've gone through this in my head as far as what they could potentially be thinking about Vic Beasley, and again, if he has a monster year and they're proven right, and then you let him walk. I mean, sure, I guess you're getting a 3rd-round comp pick, but then you start thinking about, you open up Pandora's box, and apparently they had trade offers for him in past years, and who knows what the offer was there. I mean, I'm assuming it's not better than a potential 3rd-round comp pick, but again, it's a very perplexing. I mean, the biggest storyline for me of the offseason, other than, the investment in the offensive line, was this Vic Beasley decision as far as what they're thinking goes. Because again, if he has a monster year and you let him walk, but you were proven right, and he actually does end up being a great pass rusher, then at that point you look even more foolish, I think, than maybe what they look now as far as investing in this guy that really hasn't shown it in the last 2 years. But yeah, I don't know what more we can add to it. I think we've said kind of a lot of what could be said.
You have any other thoughts on any of these other contracts before we jump into some of the camp battles?
Not really. I mean,
we didn't really talk about Keanu Neal.
Yeah, I guess with Keanu, I mean, I think, obviously they signed up for his 5th-year option, which is $6.46 million in 2020. So I think they're going to let, Deion Jones play out a little bit first. But I do think, for me personally, I think he would be right after Deion Jones got done, as opposed to Austin Hooper. And again, that's why I think Hooper isn't for certain. But I do get your reasoning and your logic behind why he should be a priority, as far as, if you're going to let Mohamed Sanu go, you got an agent Julio Jones. You don't want to let too many offensive weapons go in one off season. But at the same time, again, if I was a betting man, I'd say Austin Hooper will be back too. But, depending on how high these contracts go, Keanu Neal, I mean, the safety market with Landon Collins was in the $14 million range. And, again, I know I'm focusing on the per year averages, but that works into the total figure. And then from the total figure, you're looking at a percentage, a 60% range, maybe, for guaranteed money. So, we're talking big deals now. So Deion Jones is obviously something to monitor. I think Keanu Neal is something to monitor, because then that could have a ripple effect on the rest of the roster in some regards. That's why I don't think that there's no way Devondre Campbell can come back. If they can get Devondre Campbell under contract with Keanu Neal, with Deion Jones, with Grady Jarrett, all these guys, I mean, there is no middle class anymore on the roster, really. It's like Mins, vet Mins, draft picks, and these big contracts. Like, there's virtually no room, in my opinion, for the middle ground, which would be crazy, and what that might do for the quality of depth. But yeah, I mean, obviously Keanu Neal's certainly a priority in my mind. I think with Grady Jarrett, and I know this is a hot take on Falcons Twitter, but I think those two are the more indispensable defensive playmakers. I think Deion Jones is right there in third, but I know everyone loves Deion Jones. Everyone loves the splash plays he makes. I mean, it is a pass-happy league, so coverage linebackers are vital, and he's one of the best. But I think from a down-to-down consistency standpoint, overall well-rounded players, Grady Jarrett and Keanu Neal are above Deion Jones. So he's a major priority, and I know that'll eventually get done too, pending he comes back to full strength from the ACL, which I have no doubts that he will. But yeah, that'll be one to monitor, I think, right after Deion Jones.
Yeah, no, I think the reason why I think Keanu Neal won't be immediately a priority is just because that 5th-year option means that he's signed through 2020. So the Falcons don't need, like, that's the difference between Austin Hooper. Like, this is the last year of Austin Hooper's contract. So if they don't get a deal done by next March, he's gone. Like with Keanu Neal, they can wait till the next summer. Like, after they get Deion Jones, after they get Austin Hooper, after they do whatever they do, he could be the big guy that the Falcons are looking to extend next summer before training camp, before he goes into his final year, before he hits free agency the following year. And then, that's one of the benefits of having that 5th-year option, where it just gives you a little bit more time to pay some of these guys. And, what's going to be interesting with Keanu Neal is Kevin Byard, the safety for the Titans, is a free agent next year. So he could move the market forward off of what you see with Landon Collins, off what you saw with Honey Badger, with some of these guys making these $14 million a year. So if Byard, winds up, making $15 million a year, that's only going to potentially push Keanu Neal's price tag up even more. But again, I think for these players, these key players like a Keanu Neal, like a Deion Jones, the Falcons are going to find ways to pay all these guys, because I think they are core players to your team. It's this is not meant to be a knock on Devondre Campbell, but it is like I don't think he's a core player. I think he's a good, solid player that contributes on Sunday, has a lot of valuable versatility. But I think when you look at Devondre Campbell from a pure valuation standpoint, you're kind of like, well, we can get a second or third round pick that can do a lot of the things that Devondre Campbell does, and maybe even more things than Devondre Campbell does. And that guy's going to be, making potentially like a tenth of the price that it would take to keep Devondre Campbell. So it is that sort of middle class of players that aren't necessarily the top 8 to 10 players on your roster, are really in that like 11 to 20 range if you're ranking players that are going to wind up being hurt by all these big money deals that the Falcons are going to have to give out. And those are going to be the players that the Falcons are going to have to wind up replacing and really having to hit on their draft picks to replace those guys, because those guys are going to be sort of cycling out, as well as some of the older players like the Alex Max, like the Desmond Trufants, some of these guys that are going to be starting to get cycled out off the roster probably in the next 2 to 3 years as well. So I think the Falcons are in a good spot. They're not obviously in a great spot, but as you said, they're not going to be major players in free agency. They might be able to make moves like a James Carpenter, like a Jamon Brown, like a Jack Crawford. But if people are going to be expecting them to make big splash moves and make these big giant signings the next couple of off seasons, I think you just kind of need to put that dream to bed, because it's probably not going to happen.
They never do, though. They never do.
Yeah, I mean, it's really been the situation they've been in the last couple of years. So, like, we'll see. But we'll always find a way. Like every offseason, we'll be like, well, they could put $8 million here and sign a Justin Houston or sign a Don Terry Cole.
I'll be the ringleader on it as usual.
We always wind up doing it, and every year we get disappointed. So
yeah,
we'll keep playing that game every offseason. Yeah. Let's talk about some of these training camp battles and looking ahead to the next couple of weeks in training camp that start. The rookies report Thursday, if I'm not mistaken, Matt?
Yeah, Thursday.
And then the veterans are Monday.
Yep, and then practice starts Tuesday, the 22nd.
So, training camp is right around the corner. Next show we're going to be talking about, that first day of training camp. So, it's going to be interesting with some of these battles, because I think, like we've seen the last couple of summers, there's not that many roster spots that are really up for grabs. It's really just like maybe half a dozen, maybe 6 to 8 roster spots where guys are vying for spots. But for the most part, like most of the battles are really about not necessarily guys fighting for a roster spot, like the winner stays and the loser goes. It's really just like the winner is the starter, or the winner is the number 2 guy, and the loser is like the 3rd string guy or something like that. And those are really where most of the key roster battles are. That one, looking at the offensive line, is one of those primary ones where, the left guard, and right tackle positions are technically up for grabs, but we'll sort of see as training camp resolves, how quickly do we start seeing Chris Lindstrom and Caleb McGarry, the Falcons' 2 top picks? When do they start taking first team reps in practice? Is it the first week? Is it the second week? Is it the 3rd week? Or is it, possibly never in maybe 1 or 2 of those cases? And, obviously Ty Sambrailo is probably going to start at right tackle. I'm expecting Jamon Brown to start training camp with the ones at right guard, James Carpenter at left guard. You're going to have Schweitzer somewhere in the mix at left guard or center, Lindstrom at right guard, possibly getting some reps at left guard as well. Caleb McGarry pushing Sambrailo at the right tackle spot. So I'm curious, sort of, Matt, we've talked about this a number of times, but for those people that haven't been watching each and every show or listening to each and every show, sort of give your overview of how you think this offensive line competition is going to shape out.
Yeah, I still think kind of at the end of the day, the rookies are going to prevail on that right side. I think Lindstrom, McGarry, the way they prioritize it, the way they went up and traded up for McGarry, the first round picks have typically, under this regime, played right away for the most part. So Dan Quinn's not afraid to play the young guys. I think at the end of the day, I agree, Jamon Brown, Sambrailo will start for the first couple weeks probably as the starters, maybe even start the first preseason game or 2. But, when it's all said and done, when the dust settles, I think Lindstrom and McGarry will be the starting right guard and right tackle, and will be so for hopefully, a decade. The left guard one is the one that I had my eye on. As you know, as listeners of the show, people that follow me on Twitter know, I'm big on Jamon Brown. You know, being that left guard, being the guy that's more than maybe just a stopgap. I think he's shown flashes. Consistency's just mainly been one of the bigger issues. And I do think some of his best football is in front of him. And, again, based on the contract that they gave him, you would think they feel the same way about him. The only, I guess, issue is, left guard has not been his natural spot, at least not over the last couple of years. He did play it in 2016, I believe, was the last time, or it might have been 2017 with the Rams. But, whereas James Carpenter has been a natural left guard, that's where he's played his entire career, spanning from 2013 to the present with Seattle and New York. So he's got the leg up there now. I did catch during, some of the OTAs and off-season programs that Jamon did start mixing in a little bit on the left side. So, I mean, that bodes well. And, my hope is that he will overtake James Carpenter. But, everywhere you read, and you can't always trust some of these, outside sources because they don't follow the Falcons as closely as we do. But, everyone seems to be projecting James Carpenter there at left guard. So, that's the one I'll have my eye on the most because, again, with the way James Carpenter's contract structured, they can get out of it, much easier than they can Jamon Brown. Jamon Brown's pretty much locked in for the next couple of years at, $4 to $6 million in 2019 and 2020 respectively. So to have a backup sitting on the bench for $5 million is not ideal. But again, I think the Falcons' philosophy too has been they don't really care about that. They're all about, not having what happened last year with the injuries and not having the proper depth. So, I mean, maybe that's going to be what happens here, and they're fine having Jamon Brown be the backup to Lindstrom and Carpenter, but we'll see what happens. So that's certainly one that I had my eye on. As far as, the rest of the roster, to get into some of these other ones before we, head out on tonight's show, I'm curious about Marcus Green. He's one of the more intriguing draft picks of this past class. I'm very curious whether he's going to be a running back or a receiver. We've seen a little bit of both thus far this summer. I know he started off with a hamstring injury, I think it was, and kind of didn't get a lot of work in the summer. So I'm curious to see what their plan is for him, because I think that will have a ripple effect on the rest of the roster too, as far as, is there a possibility for a fifth running back then? Maybe. I mean, Brian Hill is a guy I would hope would stick based on what we saw towards the end of last season. I wouldn't want them to let him go, because I do think he could be a useful reserve in the event of an injury. If Green, kind of is a running back, I think that would make Kenyon Barner redundant, and I don't think there'd be a need to keep him around. And then, also, is this the end of the fullback in Atlanta? With 5 running backs, if they were to keep Hill and Green as running backs, I don't think Ricky Ortiz stands a good chance of making the roster. So be kind of a changing of the guard there, since they've had a fullback since 2015 when Kyle Shanahan came on board. And then, the other 2 points on offense, and I'll let you maybe touch on some of the defense. I am looking at Justin Hardy a bit and seeing what happened with him as far as, how his market played out and how he ended up having to come back to Atlanta on a veteran minimum deal. And, obviously Atlanta, pounced on that opportunity just, from a flexibility standpoint, and it's kind of just a no-brainer. I mean, Hardy's a useful reserve, but it also tells you that, he's not necessarily locked into anything. So, can a guy like Olamide Zaccheaus, who's going to be one of my, what I think the best undrafted free agent they brought in, can he potentially give you what Justin Hardy did? And then at that point, again, going back to the Green debate, if Green is looked at as both a running back receiver, you kind of have your 6th receiver there. Maybe Hardy's not necessarily locked into a roster spot, but, also the more I think about it, going back to, talking about Mohamed Sanu and how he's likely on his last year in Atlanta, perhaps, maybe they want to, shelter Justin Hardy on the depth chart one more time and potentially bring him back again on the cheap. kind of has a way to compensate for parting ways with Mohamed Sanu. So basically, I don't think it's I don't think it's likely that he's gone, but it is something I'm going to be looking at because I do think they brought quite a few receivers in. They have a few holdovers from last year with Christian Blake and Devin Gray, and Devin Gray was someone that kind of flashed at times in preseason. So maybe he takes that next step in his development, on the Plan D program and maybe pushes for one of those fringe roster spots. So I'm looking at Hardy there a little bit, and then also Eric Saubert going into year 3. The fact that they brought in Luke Stocker, his roster spot, I think, is pretty much a certainty at tight end 2. And then they brought back Logan Paulson, who was an effective tight end 2, but probably better suited for a tight end 3 spot. So, Eric Saubert has a challenge. He's got to prove that he's, noticeably better than Logan Paulson. I know you can say that he's a draft pick and you have him under control for another year, but again, if it's close and you have these decisions to make up at the top of the offensive depth chart with running backs and whatnot, and how many to keep, Eric Saubert could be the odd man out. And so I think he's certainly, in a prove-it year, much like some of the other guys from the 2017 class. Maybe you're going to touch on Duke Riley in a bit, but I think he's in that same mold as far as he needs something to prove to show that he deserves that final roster spot.
Yeah. I think with the defense, you're looking at some interesting battles, particularly in the front 7, I think, and obviously in the secondary with the 2 rookies that the Falcons drafted. You're going to have some interesting competitions. But again, I think particularly in the secondary, you're looking at sort of guys fighting over depth roles, particularly at that cornerback position. I think looking up front, you look at some of the battles at the back end of the rotation. We kind of know, 6, possibly 7 of the guys that are going to make the roster. I would put John Kaminsky on that group of locks. I don't feel like his roster spot's going to be challenged. I think really what John Kaminsky is going to be fighting for and battling as a rookie is how much of a role does he have on Sundays? How much of a role does he have in the rotation? But I don't think he's really in danger of getting cut just because of how high he was drafted and just the latent talent that he has. And I think the Falcons are going to at least try to keep him around for at least 3 years to see if they can get that talent out of him. I think he's pretty safe. But I think it does put guys like Rashid Hageman particularly as sort of on the bubble right now, just because of you look at that D tackle group. The Falcons are pretty deep there at that interior group with Tyler Davison, with Deidre Sinat, with Jack Crawford and Grady Jarrett and those guys. And do they need to carry an extra D tackle, or do the Falcons move Hageman back out to being more of a defensive end, which he was early in his Falcon career, but didn't necessarily thrive in that role? So I think Hageman, the suspension actually kind of helps him, just because he's going to be suspended for the first 2 games and he's not going to count against the roster. So it's not really like the Falcons don't have to cut him to make a decision when they're cutting everybody else. So they can kind of delay that decision 2 weeks, depending on how well he plays. But it could also be somewhat of a hindrance just because they're not going to get value out of him those first 2 weeks. And if someone else like a Michael Bennett or someone else like a Justin Zimmer comes along and really plays in balls this summer, that could wind up, hurting Hageman's chances of making the roster, just because that guy's going to be able to contribute on the field week 1, week 2, and Hageman won't. So we'll have to sort of see how that plays out. Depends on sort of whether Hageman hits the ground running. You look at the linebacker group. I think this is going to be an interesting battle because I think you're looking at a player like Jermaine Grace, whether or not he can really fight for a back-end roster spot and be one of the 6 linebackers. You know who the 3 starters are going to be, Campbell, Jones, and Olakun. I think Ishmael's pretty much as close to a lock as you can get as a depth standpoint, just because he's a proven guy, has a role on special teams, has been consistent in that capacity over these last 4 years. I do think Duke Riley is relatively safe. I wouldn't sit here and say he's a lock, but I just think just because the Falcons aren't going to just throw away Duke Riley at this point, particularly for whether it's a Jermaine Grace or one of these undrafted free agents that has limited experience. I don't think they're going to – essentially the way you could think about it is Duke Riley started 16 games for the Falcons. Depth has been an issue at the linebacker position, certainly last year and in previous years. And I don't think the Falcons are going to throw away 16 starts off the roster. Now, we may see a situation again where Jermaine Grace comes in and outproduces Duke Riley to the point that Duke Riley is that like 6th linebacker that's often inactive on game days. And we could see that, but I don't think he's going to push Duke Riley completely off the roster. I think if Jermaine Grace is going to come in, or one of these other undrafted free agents like a Trey Crawford, you mentioned Zacchaeus as sort of the best of the undrafted free agents. I would agree with that. I think if you're going to pick a number 2 guy, it may be Trey Crawford. So if one of these guys is going to jump up and make a roster spot like a Grace or a Crawford, or one of these other guys like Yorick Bethune, who I think also has a lot of talent to hone and develop, I think Bruce Carter is the guy that's the most vulnerable, just because he's the older of the guy, has less quote unquote upside. Even though he did perform well last year in limited opportunities, I just think if the Falcons are going to quote unquote give up on a player, it's more likely to be the guy that has sort of the least tenure here among those 3 in Duke Riley, Kamal Ishmael, and Bruce Carter. So secondary, I think the battle between Kendall Sheffield and Jordan Miller for that 4th corner spot is going to be interesting. They also have Bleedy Ray Wilson, who, we know what Bleedy Ray is. He's sort of in that Kamal Ishmael sort of mold where he's a proven commodity. You know exactly what he is. And should Miller struggle this summer and not necessarily win that 4th cornerback spot behind Trufant Oliver and DeMonte Casey, you didn't have Bleedy Ray Wilson ready to fill those shoes. So I think Bleedy Ray is going to be pretty safe, because outside of Desmond Trufant, you really don't have any experienced corners on this roster. Like Oliver's a first-year starter, played 250 snaps last year. Casey's moving from safety. We think he has a lot of upside at cornerback, but he's not necessarily proven yet in that regard. So having a veteran like Bleedy Ray Wilson on the roster, just to basically be an insurance policy in case these young guys, struggle or are inconsistent or whatever the case that often comes with youth, I think that makes Bleedy Ray pretty safe for the time being. Again, not a lock, but a guy that should, unless some crazy stuff happens, should be on the roster. And then the safety position, I think, is another interesting battle, because like the Falcons signed JJ Wilcox, and I've been sort of trying to figure out why the Falcons signed JJ Wilcox, because I don't think he's better than Sherrod Neesman. I don't think he's really better than Jordan Richards either. So I'm trying to figure out why the Falcons signed JJ Wilcox. Maybe it's for special teams value, but then again, I think Neesman and Richards are probably better in that capacity. So it's an interesting thing, because you see a lot of reports that seem to suggest that JJ Wilcox is a lock to make the team, which I think he is pretty safe to make the roster, but it could wind up pushing a guy like Sherrod Neesman off the roster. But why? Because Neesman played so well down the stretch for the team. Why are you trying to replace him? And then you have a young guy like Chris Cooper, who flashed a little bit of talent at Stony Brook and is kind of a hard hitter, fast, rangy guy. So I'm very curious. I don't have an insight into how the safety position plays out. I think we're probably going to see both Wilcox and Neesman make the team, but I don't really have a good handle on this one. And so I'm very intrigued by this battle in particular, because we talked about being confused about what the Falcons' plan is with Vic Beasley. I'm kind of confused about what their plan is in terms of safety depth going into the summer. So I'm very intrigued to see how this winds up playing out.
I mean, you and me both, man. I don't know what more Neesman needs to do to secure, a future in Atlanta. I think you would have thought the way he filled in there and kind of took over for Jordan Richards, in place of Keanu Neal would have been enough. I mean, Pro Football Focus rated him highly. So yeah, that one's a head scratcher, and I'm certainly going to have my eye on that one, because I think with Wilcox, I see him more in the vein of a strong safety. I know you seem to think he maybe could play, or he has played in the past some single high, but I don't think that's his best role, and I don't think single high is Sherrod Neesman's best role, and that's kind of the only place he kind of fits at this point now. If Wilcox is a lock, because again, they gave Wilcox a similar deal that they gave, Tyler Davison, and guaranteed $200,000 of his salary. So that seems to think that they want him around in 2019. And with that being said, you got Neesman versus Cooper at free safety, and I think Cooper fits that mold and fits that role better. And the early reports, from Jason Butt in The Athletic were they want to give Cooper more looks at free safety because he's flashed some good stuff for them. So, my prediction is Cooper beats out Neesman, and unfortunately Neesman is left, outside of Atlanta again for, no good reason really. He should be the backup strong safety heading into 2019, but for whatever reason that might not be the case. So yeah, I certainly have my eye on that one. And then with the defensive line, just to add one thing there, I mean, I think Kaminsky and Hagman are the most critical pieces as far as watching them and seeing if the Falcons need to address the defensive line anymore, because as you said, they're kind of locked in with Sanat, Davison, Jarrett, and Crawford in the interior. Claiborne, Tack, and Vic are locks on the outside. So if Kaminsky can hold down that strong side defensive end role, then you don't need to necessarily go out and get someone like a Nick Perry or someone like an Alan Bailey. And then obviously, you mentioned the suspension with Hagman certainly buys him some time to stick around. And then as far as what he does with his time in preseason and training camp, that'll determine whether they want to keep him around after the suspension. But those two, I think, are super critical. If they show they belong, then I don't think fans should really expect any more moves on the defensive line going into the season. It would just be, knock on wood, if injuries were to hit, then at that point is when they would call up some of those guys like Bailey or whatever if he's still out there.
So we do have a mailbag question from Ryan 2 Jones on Twitter. He is the Falcons fan MVP, by the way. Do you think the new pass interference review rule will most likely help the Falcons or hurt the Falcons, both offensively and defensively?
So, I think this is one of those things where, it's going to help teams, it's going to hurt teams, and the Falcons are not going to be any exception to that. I think, and it's not just because of the Saints were crybabies about this and got this to be changed that you can now review this, but I just don't understand. All right, we're going to start reviewing everything in a couple of years, it seems like, with the way things are trending, and the game's long enough as it is. So, yeah, this is going to be a rule that, sure, we're going to, get the short end of the stick on, and then we're also going to benefit from. I know fans probably are thinking, well, Robert Alford's no longer in the team, so they don't have to worry about, or at least half of the defensive pass interferences are going to be cut in half. But yeah, I don't know. There's no good answer for this. We're going to have to see how it plays out. This is a uncharted territory, and kind of like the targeting rule from either last year or the year before. I forget when it was in the preseason. We saw how kind of excessive they were and how trigger happy they were. I guess we're going to see how often it happens in the preseason, and that'll be a good gauge to determine what's in store for the regular season and how often this is going to come into play and really affect the game. But yeah, if I had to guess, I'm sure it's going to help us. I'm sure it's going to hurt us. Hopefully it doesn't hurt us at a very critical moment in a game or a playoff game or whatever it be. But with the Falcons' luck, I'm sure it probably will.
Yeah, my answer is similar. Like, I don't see any reason to think the Falcons will be especially hurt more than the average NFL team, or especially helped more so than the average NFL team. I mean, maybe if you're thinking like, finally Julio Jones will stop getting, beat up or whatever, like maybe, I guess, but like, I don't know. Like, obviously there's many prominent instances that I know Falcon fans would point to over the Falcons' history where, a defender got away with a very questionable physical contact in the closing minutes of a game that the Falcons lost against, maybe two prominent examples came against two NFC West teams or something like that. So, I understand why people are like, oh, finally we get our comeuppance. You're right. Sort of the Saints have sort of pushed this over, but I think people have been talking about how pass interference should be reviewed for many, many years because of, it being a spot foul and basically being able to swing a drive. Because like if you throw up a pass and there's a little bit of contact and all of a sudden it's like a 35-yard penalty or something like that. So we'll have to see how it plays out. But yeah, I don't see any reason to think that the Falcons will be especially helped or hurt by this in comparison to.
Do you think, not to cut you off, but do you think this could potentially, depending on how it all plays out in the 2019 season, but do you think this could change, pass interference from being a spot foul to then being like a 15-yard penalty or a 10-yard, whatever it is in college?
I mean, that's possible. I like, I
That
don't have
could be. Yeah.
any insight into
Right.
whether or not they would change. I know, generally speaking, the NFL likes to differentiate itself from the college game just for reasons or whatever. Um, so I don't see a exact. I can't envision a scenario that would sort of prompt that. Particularly if they're reviewable now, which assumes that refs will be able to get it right more often than not.
Yeah, I
So
guess.
I guess there's no reason to change the rule if they get it right more. So yeah, I don't know. Like the way I sort of think about these rules is just generally speaking, as over the course of a season with different officiating crews, the level of officiating is pretty balanced across the league. It may not seem fair for that one particular week, but then like the next week you'll get a lot of calls in your favor, and so it kind of balances itself out pretty evenly across the league. I know a lot of people in the state of Louisiana feel like that statement is a lie, but many people in the state of Georgia would say that the Saints have gotten away with a lot of stuff over the years, and it winds up balancing itself out. So again, different strokes for different folks. So yeah, to answer Ryan Two James' question, I don't really think it's going to really benefit the Falcons or really any team one way or the other.
Yeah.
So guys, we appreciate you guys for being patient with us and tuning in tonight for another robust Falcon Central Radio show. You guys can check us out as usual on YouTube, on the Pro Football Central YouTube page. Definitely want to hit subscribe. Definitely want to hit that bell icon moving forward. Facebook is also where you can hit us up at Falcon Central Radio. Of course, we do a lot of interacting with you guys on Twitter. That's the way that you can submit your mailbag questions using the hashtag Falcons Mailbag. Send them to the show's Twitter handle at Falcons PFC. You can send them to my Twitter handle is at Falcfans, FALCFANS. You can send them to Matt's Twitter handle, which is at Matt Karoly. That's MATTKAROLY. And yeah, we'll be back next week to talk about training camp and see what's going on those first couple of days. And we'll just keep chugging along as the season picks up and be coming at you guys every week from here into the end of the year, hopefully, as long as we don't have any other issues come up like we did the last couple of weeks. I know we promised this stuff, but didn't renege on those promises. But yeah, so yeah, send in your questions, guys, because I know you guys are going to have a bunch. So for next week, since training camp is kicking off, and hopefully, maybe we'll be talking about a Deion Jones or Julio Jones contract as well. So Matt, anything you want to plug or say before we duck out of here?
No, I mean, hopefully we're trying to get a few guests, some insiders for the Falcons on during training camp. So hopefully we do that, and you guys tune in for that, and maybe get some inside information that you can't get anywhere else but Falcon Central Radio.
There you have it, guys. Appreciate you tuning in tonight. We'll see you guys next week.